Hello everyone, it is Mark Sabatella from Mastering MuseScore here, and welcome to the Music Masterclass. This is where we talk about different aspects of making music, composition, arranging, improvisation, playing by ear, and all acts of creative music making. And as we've been doing the last couple of months, and we'll be doing for another month or so, we are focused on harmony, focused on focused on the work that we're doing within my harmony and chord progressions course. And what we've been working on this week specifically is diminished chords. And so I'm going to talk some about diminished chords and how they're used and give a couple examples and show a couple of the projects that people have done. And I'll also go back and review a couple other projects from some of the other assignments on secondary dominants and borrowed chords. So that's what we're up to today. What I want to do is I'm going to start with an example that I think is just a really good example to use in discussing diminished chords. So let me talk about what this example actually is. This is a piece by Antonio Carlos Jobim called Corcovado, otherwise known as Quiet Nights of Quiet Stars. And Jobim is a Brazilian, or was a Brazilian composer, considered like the father of bossa nova style. And as you know, I don't actually know his early history, but I can tell you based on his music that he's influenced both by the Brazilian traditions that came before him, in particular the choro tradition and some of the classical dance traditions, but also jazz traditions. And so, and he's also was steeped in classical harmony in terms of like Chopin and so forth, Romantic era harmony. And so this is one of his pieces, Corcovado, and this is just the second half of the piece. And I want to play it and then talk about the diminished chords, because there's basically three different types of diminished chord in here that really nails the what diminished chords are kind of all about. And I would say that's kind of a hallmark of Jobim, really masterful use of diminished chords. So I'm going to play through this thing and then come back and talk about where the diminished chords are. All right, so this is the second half of the piece. So, hey, good to see you, Peter. So let's talk about what's going on with the diminished chords. So first of all, the piece is in A minor. And so it starts and ends on an A minor chord. I mean, this is, again, just the midpoint of it's kind of an A, B, A, C form. And so this is the second A and then the C section. And so it starts with the one chord. And this is something worth noting that's not related to diminished chords. Notice that this one chord is voiced with a sixth. This is a very common technique in jazz and other modern music to voice the one chord, whether it's major or minor, as a sixth chord. And it's especially interesting in minor keys, because if you want to do this in a minor key, you really want to do that major six. You want to have that F sharp on it. You're not going to want to voice this chord. I mean, it's a fine chord when you want that level of dissonance, but this doesn't really work as a tonic chord. This dissonance between the F and the E is kind of harsh. And I've made this point a few times before in the course, and this actually does wrap back to diminished chords. Notes a half step above chord tones are considered usually more dissonant than notes a whole step above. So the fact that that F natural is a half step above a chord tone that's more dissonant than a whole step above. And so this is a situation where in this type of context, jazz, bossa nova, a lot of other types of music, for the one chord, we very often voice it as a minor sixth chord, and it will have that major sixth, meaning it's not strictly diatonic, right? If we think about A minor being just the white notes, F sharp is outside the key. It's outside the key signature, if nothing else. But it's because, we have melodic minor and harmonic minor. Basically, in minor keys, either sixth, either seventh is considered fair game. We don't really consider them non-diatonic. They're like honorary members of the key. So anyhow, we have our one chord voiced as a minor sixth chord. And so that's some stuff about that. The next chord is one of these diminished chords, right? And it's a G sharp diminished. Now this is the one that we would most expect to see in the key of A minor. Because if we play a harmonic minor scale, that's our seventh degree, and the diatonic seventh chord that we get built on G sharp is a diminished seventh chord. So we would totally expect to see some G sharp diminished chords. And so if the song went like this, and then came back to A minor, that would be the normal thing that we expect diminished chords to do. The 7 chord resolving to 1. But Jobim does the other thing that diminished chords do sometimes, which is resolve down a half step. So his G sharp diminished goes down to G minor. Before I talk about that, I will point out that the melody notes, the E is a whole step above a chord tone, and the G in the melody is a whole step above a chord tone. So he's relying on the fact that he can use those notes. And it resolves down a half step. Now, diminished chords can resolve down a half step almost whenever they want. But it's especially common to the point of it's really hard to find examples that are something different than this. It's especially common when they're resolving to a 2 chord. So this G sharp diminished is going to G minor 7. And you might say, hey, we're in the key of A minor. G minor 7 isn't the 2 chord. Well, no, it's not the 2 chord of the main key, but it is tonicizing this F chord that's coming later. This is a 2-5-1. G minor to C7 to F. I'll come to that diminished chord in the middle there in a minute. So we have 2-5-1. So in the key of F, this is a 2-5-1. So that G sharp is resolving down a half step. Peter's asking, how is G a whole step above a chord tone? Well, you have to realize that when someone writes a diminished chord in a lead sheet, they really mean a fully diminished 7th chord. So even though it just says triad, it implies the 7th. This is a convention used very, very often that just, we don't bother writing the 7th. It's understood to be present. And so it's a whole step above the chord tone F. So it's available for use, that 7th. So this G sharp diminished is going down a half step to G. So in the key of F, that would be sharp 2 diminished going to 2 to 5 to 1. So that's one of the common uses of diminished chords that's becomes common, late 19th century. It's hard to find examples of that motion, that diminished chord resolving down a half step. It's really hard to find examples of that pre-Romantic era. I'm not saying there aren't any, but offhand, I don't know of any. But starting in the Romantic era, that sharp 2 diminished going down to 2 is quite common. So this is a whole step above the chord tone F. And yes, that definitely makes it a half step below, but that is not considered as dissonant. And this just came up in the course. There was someone else was commenting about this, Richard, one of the Richards, that the fact that there's a dissonance between this and the G sharp, a half step, is not considered as bad, as problematic as the whole step. Now, how am I going to say this? I'm saying this, no. Being a whole step above a chord tone is fine. Being a half step below a chord tone is also fine. We're really concerned with the interval above chord tones, and part of the reason is we expect the voicing to be below the melody. And so this note is not going to have a half step right below it, nor is it going to have a minor ninth below it. It's going to have a major ninth below it. If the melody note had been F sharp, then we would have this clash, this minor ninth clash, which is much worse than the major ninth clash. This is a general truism that you will find that does go back centuries. That minor ninth interval is considered more dissonance than major ninth intervals. And that's not all there is to it, but that's part of the story. So we don't worry about the fact that that note's a half step below a chord tone. That's going to be quite common. Lots of nice notes are a half step below chord tones, but it's the half step above chord tones that's a little more problematic. And the one situation where we accept it is the 5 chord can have a flat 9, and that is the one situation where we love that sound of the half step above the chord tone. That's like really the only situation where we use that sound. All right, so let's come now to the 2, 5, 1 and F. On the recordings, this diminished chord is not played most of the time. Some of the time it is, but most of the time it's not. So it's sort of an affectation. It's a thing that gets thrown in every once in a while. And what it is, he's calling this F diminished going to F, and this is one of the other kinds of diminished chords. So far we've seen the sharp 2 going down to 2, the diminished chord resolving down a half step. Now we're seeing the diminished chord resolving to a major chord on the same root. Well, that is common also. And what it really is, if you think about it, it's like an F chord with 2 non-chord tones in it. So some people would call this just an F chord with a double appoggiatura. That would be the classical term for these 2 non-chord tones that are played on the beat and then resolved. And again, the melody note is a whole step above a chord tone, and we get this really rich sound. So we have diminished chord resolving down a half step. We have diminished chord resolving to a major chord on the same root. Those are 2 of the 3 types of diminished chords. And then we have lots of other stuff. And if we think about this section as being in the key of C, I'm gonna actually make that claim that for this next section. Let me play this, and then you'll hear this. Had he ended it on a C major chord, we would have totally accepted this song as being in the key of C. Because it ends on a 2, 5, and really all these chords are diatonic pretty much in C, right? 3 to 6 to 2 to 5, and then a deceptive resolution to 3, which is a secondary dominant going to secondary dominant 6, and setting up a final 2, 5, 1. We would have totally accepted this song as being in the key of C for those last 8 bars, in which case this is a minor 4 chord going to flat 7. So this is that borrowed chord business here. Minor 4 going to flat 7, and then deceptive resolution to 3, to 6, to 2, 5, and then deceptive resolution to 3, played as a secondary dominant, to 6 as a secondary dominant, and then 2, 5, and then instead of resolving to 1, he suddenly remembers, oh, wait a minute, I want to end up in A minor, right? I started in A minor, I want to end in A minor. Now, you don't have to. Lots of songs start in the relative minor, end in the relative major, especially in the world of these sort of jazz standards. In fact, almost most of the songs you might think of as being minor that are part of that, 20th century popular song book genre, My Funny Valentine starts minor, ends major. Blue Sky starts minor, ends major. Lots of these songs start minor, end in the relative major. So it would have been totally expected for this song to end major. But he's like, well, I want to end minor, so I'll just let it resolve deceptively from 5 to 6. But rather than just let it resolve 5 directly to 6, he does this thing that I've mentioned before that I do a lot, maybe even too much, not resolving 5 directly to 6, but instead letting 5 go by way of this sharp 5 diminished, then 6. So now we're basically tonicizing the A minor, giving that A minor a 7 chord. So now we have the diminished chord resolving up a half step. Well, this is all 3 of the basic types of diminished chord that we expect to see. The most common is the one he says for last here, the diminished chord going up a half step to tonicize the next chord. Then we have the Romantic era version here of the sharp 2 coming down to 2. And then we also have this other version here of the double appoggiatura, right? This is the 2 non-chord tones resolving. That's all 3 types of diminished chord. So, Beatrice, I see you're asking, how to catch up on this. I don't know if you've watched the lessons on diminished chords, but what I'm done right here is summarized a whole section's worth of lessons. There's like an hour's worth of material on diminished chords in the course. So make sure you watch those. And then when you come back and watch this, it'll make more sense. So yeah, this is intended to be a quick review of the things that were in the course. But if you haven't watched all of the videos in the course yet, up until this point, then it's and completed all the examples, completed all the exercises, gotten practice using all these techniques, then yeah, you're going to want to kind of do that first and then come back and rewatch this. So this piece has all 3 types of diminished chord in it. It also has secondary dominants, right? That 3 dominant going to 6 dominant going to 2, and it also has borrowed chords, minor 4 going to flat 7. It's got and a secondary 2/5, the tonicization of the F chord here, right? I said, well, we're kind of in the key of F, but we're not in the key of F. F is just the 4 chord in the key of C, or the flat 6 chord in the key of A minor. It's not, we haven't really modulated to F. This is a tonicization, so it's a secondary 2/5. So anyhow, this song has everything that we've looked at so far. It's got diatonic chords, it's got secondary dominants, it's got borrowed chords, all 3 favored of diminished chords, and so forth. So this G sharp here at the end, I would say, is a different function. Let me just mute this over here. Even though it's the same chord, it's the same G sharp diminished chord, this one is functioning to set up that G minor, but it's not tonicizing it. It's not, G sharp diminished is not in the key of G minor. So this isn't a tonicization happening. It's just a chord that leads there. This G sharp at the end of the piece is literally tonicizing the A minor, because in the key of A minor, G sharp is a diminished, is a diatonic chord. It's the expected 7 chord. So whenever you have diminished chords going up a half step, they're tonicizing the next chord, and so it's doing one thing. When you see G sharp, when you see a diminished chord going down a half step, they're not coming from the same key. This G sharp diminished doesn't come from the same key as the G minor chord. So there's something different happening. So from a functional perspective, they're different functions, the same chord, but serving a different function. Yeah, that's going to be fairly common. Well, not that common, but there's going to be other examples. Like later on, we're going to see B flat 7 being used in the key of C as what's called a tritone substitution, and we'll be talking about that more next week as well. But yeah, you can have the same chord in the same key do different things depending on how it resolves. So when I use the term function, I really mean, why is it there? What is explaining its purpose? What is its function? What is its purpose there? And this guy's purpose is to set up the G minor by going down a half step. This guy's purpose is to tonicize the A minor by going up a half step, and the reasons why this works is different. And so, Beatrice, I will just say, whether or not you can play the piece, depending on where your chord symbol reading skills are, that's another matter. But I guess if you have specific questions, because if you watched all of the lessons on diminished chords, everything that I've said was certainly discussed in there. And so it could be worth a review of it. Make sure you print out the handouts and relook at those. But if you have a more specific question about one particular thing I said that didn't like sound familiar based on having watched the lessons, just ask it in the chat and I'll try to answer. So meanwhile, I've talked about this piece at some length because it's just well, first of all, it's a great piece, but it's a great example of what we're working on right now, which are these different types of diminished chords, and also the just a summary of everything we've looked at in terms of use of borrowed chords and secondary dominants. So this piece really kind of encapsulates a lot of things. And really, I'm going to give you one little heads up, and then we're going to flip to some of the music that's been submitted so far. Next week, the lessons are already there, but after, I want people to kind of really focus on diminished chords first and make sure you complete the project or work on the project. But the next set of lessons have to do with augmented sixth chords, the Neapolitan, and tritone substitutions, which are variations of the same concept. That's the last new type of chord that we're going to encounter in this course. And frankly, it's really one of the last new kinds of chords that you'll ever need. Everything else that we're going to do in this course is all about really getting better at applying them, figuring out what to do with them, and recognizing you're going to do some ear training exercises and all sorts of other things, analysis, where you really get to understand how they're used in practice, looking at pieces like this and seeing everything. Next week's the next set of lessons on augmented sixth, tritone sub, and Neapolitan, which is maybe the least important of the three. That's after that, we will have a huge repertoire. We'll have all the repertoire of chords that you might need to create like amazingly complex music. And so pretty much any piece of music pre, say, 1900 that you want to look at, you will probably be able to analyze. And a lot of post-1900 music also, if it's using, 19th century language like most of these jazz standards are. So, all right, so let's go ahead and see if, as I start looking at some examples, if anything makes any more sense to anyone. So what I'm going to do is we're going to take a look at, see, that one's Jimmy's, this one's Jimmy's also. Okay, yeah, good. So we're going to look at Jimmy's example here, and he has harmonized Red River Valley and used some diminished chords, and I'm going to talk through what he's done, and then we'll see if we can explore some additional opportunities and see what's happening. So here's his starting point here. This is just diatonic chords and secondary dominants. Okay, so already I would say Jimmy has done a really interesting, nice job of picking interesting chords to start with before he even tries to throw in any diminished chords. And so I am going to talk a little bit about some of what's going on here, and then talk about a couple of choices that I think had he started with a simpler version, could have come up with some additional opportunities. So let's take a look at this. So we have 1, 6, and then he's going to 4. And then there's no actual 5 chord here. He has the 1 chord in second inversion, which, you know, is 5-ish. I've kind of made that point that 1, 6, 4, and 5 kind of work together as a pair. And I'm sure, Jimmy, you can probably confirm this, but the G in the melody makes you not want a 5 chord, right? Because if you had a D7 chord here, the 5 chord, or just a D triad, that G is going to clash with the F sharp. It's going to be that half step above chord tone thing. And so it makes you not want to put a 5 chord there. I will say people just say, I got to have my 5 chord. I'm just going to live with the melody clashing a little bit. And so a lot of people would just go ahead and put a 5 chord there and let the G clash, assume that, hey, it's just a pickup. People aren't barely going to notice it. And that is worth knowing, worth being aware of, that if your only clash is like in a passing tone somewhere, or a note that really is basically a pickup to the next measure, that you can get away with some clashes. I don't love this clash. I mean, I like what you did here to get around it. I don't love that clash. So if I were playing it, I would probably play D7 sus, right? To have let the G be in place of the F sharp. I would probably do that. But in any case, then you have an E. This is all nice circle of fifths stuff going in here. 6, going to 2, and then 2 as a dominant chord, so a secondary dominant, going to 5. So this is all nice. And again, that chord, that non-chord tone here, is a whole step above a chord tone, and it sounds really nice, and it resolves down. So that idea of having a non-chord tone that then resolves down, that's perfectly fine. Going back hundreds of years, this would be called an appoggiatura. It's a non-chord tone that we're leaping to and then stepping out of into a chord tone. And then the secondary dominant in inversion so that it can resolve up a half step is really nice. Now this, that was like brilliant. I don't think, as many times I've heard this song, as many times as people have, used it as examples, trying to reharmonize it, I don't know that I've ever heard anyone hit on that. And I love it. This is lovely. So that makes me happy. That D7, right? That secondary dominant, tonicizing the E minor chord. And then we have some more circle of fifths. So 6, 2, and then that 2 chord goes to a secondary dominant here, G7 going to C. Now this is a situation where we're going to come back to when we look at the diminished chords and see if I can do something a little different in here perhaps. But here again we have a secondary dominant, G7, tonicizing the C. And again he's used first inversion so that the bass line can step, which is nice. Then 3, 6, 2 as a secondary dominant, 5, and then he's got this ending on a 4 chord to 1, and that's sort of I've mentioned this before as that's the Let It Be. By the way, did everyone check out the new Beatles song that dropped today? I'll talk about that in a future lesson, but I just heard it for the first time this morning, it's not Let It Be. But in any case, that idea of that 4 to 1 as a kind of a closing gesture in a piece, definitely time honored. It wouldn't normally be in an inversion like this, and I don't think that this is a particularly, I guess it allows your D7 to resolve by step into the E, but then that E doesn't resolve by step anywhere else as you have it. But worked it by step, you could try to walk it up, but then you'd have it F sharp against the G. So in any case, this, if I were going to do that, I would just have the C in root position. Also, this D7 here, you can totally put it in the middle of the bar, and that would be maybe, so we have B minor, and then the advantage of putting the D in the middle of the bar is just that it straightens out the harmonic rhythm. Having this 2 beats per chord rhythm going throughout the piece, and then having a single chord that has to be only for 1 beat feels a little off kilter. It would be possible to make that work with appropriate, how you arrange your accompaniment, but there would be nothing wrong with letting that D7 be on beat 3, because the B is a whole step above a chord tone again. So, Joanne, yes, there's a new Beatles song. Well, so it's like old recording of John Lennon from, he had made a cassette demo of, and then while George Harrison was alive, the Beatles attempted, after John died, but while George was still alive, the Beatles attempted to get together to lay down some additional tracks, and then they kind of scrapped the project because the quality of the tape wasn't very good. But now with modern AI processing and so forth, they've managed to really isolate John's voice from that demo pretty well, where to the point where it doesn't sound any worse than any other 60s recordings of the Beatles. And then they've done additional processing, laid down new tracks and stuff, and have produced a new version of a song that has, and Paul and Ringo are on it as well. And so it's a Beatles, and it sounds like a Beatles song. I mean, you can tell it's a John Lennon composition, a more modern John Lennon composition, but it sounds like the Beatles, because it is. All right. So what we're going to do now is jump to Jimmy's version with the diminished chords. Now here he is using the second inversion 1 chord. So really nice things going on in here that I'm going to talk through in a second. Peter, well, first of all, if you just type Beatles song, probably it's all over the internet, because literally it just dropped today. It's kind of big deal. But Now and Then is the name of the tune. Now and Then. And it just released this morning. So you can find it on, all the major music services online, Spotify, etc. Okay, so let's take a look at some of what's going on here. He has D sharp diminished, tonicizing the E minor. So there's a case of that diminished chord resolving up a half step. Now he has a diminished chord resolving down a half step. And the thing about this is, this doesn't not work. A double negative in there, but there's nothing wrong with that sound, that diminished chord resolving down. But I will say that you don't find that downward resolution going into major chords very often. And I think maybe it's because the chords are a little too similar. C sharp diminished, going to C major. The only note that changes is the root. The really important notes here don't change. I don't know if that's the reason for it, but in general, you don't find that downward resolution going to major chords very often. In fact, you don't find it to anything except 2 very often. So that downward resolution, absolutely worth exploring, trying, but mostly think of it as something to approach the 2 chord. And usually it'll be after the 3 chord. We'll have a 3 chord, then sharp 2 diminished, then 2. Speaking of the Beatles, if I fell, I can't remember the words. Oh, please don't let it hide if I love you too. Oh, please. Right, so there's 3, sharp 2 diminished to 2. That's a super classic use of that downward diminished chord going in from into 2. So in any case, nothing wrong with that. It's just not super typical. All right. And then here, again, I mentioned he's using 1-6-4 in place of 5, and then resolving deceptively to 6, which is fine. And then he is tonicizing the A minor chord, giving it the diminished chord from above, which is great. Now, this chord, oh, I see you've actually written half diminished here. Now, the things that I talked about with diminished chords mostly would mean fully diminished chords. The stuff that I'm talking about with them rarely applies to half diminished chords, but this is one of the best exceptions that I know. If you're tonicizing the 5 chord, like we are here, D is our 5 chord, then using a half diminished chord to tonicize it is actually pretty common. I think the reason is that this chord is a little dark. I mean, diminished chords are dark, but if you're trying to tonicize 5 is inherently not a dark chord, right? The other chords that you tonicize are kind of dark. They're minor chords, or in the case of 4, it implies a flatter key. There's some darkness associated with all the other chords, but 5 is the brightest chord we have. And so somehow using this half diminished instead of fully diminished 7 is actually quite common. And that A is a whole step above a chord tone. And it also basically makes it A7, right? I mean, if you play a C sharp diminished triad and then put A on top of it, this is really A7 with C sharp in the bass, which is, of course, exactly what your original harmonization was, A7 with C sharp in the bass. So this is a super solid choice, is what I'm getting down to. The fact that it's half diminished works because you're tonicizing 5, and the melody note being a whole step above is great, and it also basically makes it A7. Now, you might, whether or not it's actually even worth calling it C sharp diminished, given that the A is in the melody, is another matter, because it sounds so much like A7. You could just call it A7, but if the melody had been an E, then the C sharp diminishedness or half diminishedness would be more significant. Does that make sense? All right, going on, we have our 5 chord, and now he's using a diminished chord, again going down by half step to approach this B7. And I'll use the same, I'll give the same comment. Oh, here he says half diminished. I got to try that. You know, I do like that sound. There's something about that outward contrary motion. C half diminished 7 having a B flat resolving up to B. There's something I like about that. But the melody note C kind of, I would like it more if the melody note wasn't kind of making it hard to hear that B flat. But in any case, this is another case of a diminished chord going down a half step, but not to the 2 chord. And you can do it, but it's not as strong. It's not exactly that thing of tonicizing, of approaching 2 from above. That's the main thing that I want to try to make happen. So I'm going to find another opportunity to use. Oh, actually, you have it already. So I'll come to that. A place where you actually are coming down a half step to get to the 2 chord. So again, you have this, man, I just love that. Going that dominant 3 going to 6. Now here, you have E minor to A7, but your A7 should be tonicizing a D chord of some kind. I mean, that would be its reason to exist, but there's no D chord in sight. I'm going to claim that A7 really isn't necessarily a good choice. It doesn't feel like it's, it doesn't necessarily, well, it doesn't make theoretical sense. I can't say why is there an A7 chord. Jimmy, you might want to give a whatever your reasoning is. But since it's not It's not a secondary dominance. It's not tonicizing anything in particular. I think we can make a better tonicization of this C by using D minor to G7. So, whoops, B7 to E minor. Now I'm going to do a quick 2-5. 2-5. 1. So that in the key of C, 2-5. Right? So that having a quick D minor to G7 to C. And here, I feel like there is a good reason to have the 1 beat per chord, because it's a 2-5. It's doing a particular thing, and we get both of the chords the same length, the 2 and the 5, as opposed to that other spot here where you have your 2 and your 5 different lengths, which just feels a little out of balance. When it's necessary, but it wasn't necessary there. So in any case, I'm going to go to the E minor and then a quick 2-5 to 1. And I could even use the same trick that Jobim used. Of playing C diminished to C. Remember how Jobim had that F diminished going to F. Here I have I could go C diminished going to C. So could do that if we wanted to have that other thing happening. And the only reason I'm thinking about it is just it gives me something to do on that note. That's the non-chord tone. And it's, again, it is a whole step above a chord tone. So that would be possible also. And now, he's got, so let's walk through what's happening here. He's got 2 diminished chords in a row. Actually, a half diminished as he's written, and then a fully diminished chord. That's something I haven't talked about, but is absolutely a thing. You know, you could work through the math of it and the theory of it, but what you'll eventually find is you can take any 2 diminished chords and play them one after each other and find something that makes them work voice leading wise and theory wise to explain it. And you will often find composers doing things like that, putting 2 diminished chords in a row. And it almost doesn't matter what they are, because the voice leading is going to work out. You know, you probably would want to voice them in a way where it looks from the roots like it should. C sharp to D sharp to E. It could be D to D sharp to E also. But anything, when you put 2 different diminished chords in a row, it's often going to work. And yeah, I don't have one specific reason I can tell you why that works, but you try out the combination, you work out your voice leading, and then you can often figure out, oh, in this case it worked because of this. Or you could just say, you know what, I can probably get away with it and do it. So here he's got the C sharp and then the D sharp diminished, and the D sharp diminished is tonicizing the E minor, right? It's resolving up a half step. Now he has the A sharp diminished resolving down a half step, which is now the thing that I say that these diminished chords going down a half step want to do, which is they want to go down a half step to set up the 2 chord. Now, it's actually more common to tonicize, to do this, to go to a minor chord, and I think it's because the voice leading, we get that. We get da-dum, da-dum, which is the if I that I think the harmonies even do that. I think the harmony parts probably have that in If I Fell, but I won't swear to it. So in any case, that one works especially well because you're going to the 2 chord, but it could work even better, I think, if it were a minor chord. But it's not like it doesn't work this way, and that's fine too. It's just when you go from here to here, again, less is changing. Really, from A sharp fully diminished 7 to A7, only one note changes, and maybe that's not enough for me to feel like I got my money's worth out of it. So letting both of those notes is the more typical thing. So, and also, no reason this couldn't have happened on beat 3, because the F sharp would have been one of those whole step above chord tones. And now here again, now this is a thing, and I got to show you this, Jimmy, because you're going to like this, I think. I had mentioned before that C over E, that 4-1 is a common thing, but I wouldn't have done it in an inversion. There is a and then I tried to play a couple of, the stepwise motion to get me to 1. There's another thing, and I'm going to show you this, and there's nothing in it that we haven't learned already. This thing of ending a tune on the final note, so the final note is the tonic, and ending it with a sharp 4 diminished chord, this is a jazz cliche that we're going to watch what I do. Whoops. That's my version of it. There's a lot of different variations on it. But sharp 4 diminished, then minor 4, which we all know is a thing, then 1 in first inversion, so minor 4 to 1, then our sharp 2 diminished, and then 2, and then a final 5 sus 1. Sometimes we get this major 7th flat 2 chord, which is something we can talk more about next week when we talk about Neapolitans and tritone substitutions. But in any case, that it's got this really nice motion, right? But also check out this motion. Does Blackbird do that? No, it doesn't quite do it, but it does something. There's something very similar to that in Blackbird. I got Beatles on the mind, but you all know what I'm talking about, right? It's very close to that. I should know how Blackbird goes, but it's a guitar piece. I don't play it on the piano. Anyhow, so some really nice stuff in there. And so that little cliche, that line, that little chord cliche that I just played is worth knowing because it's a nice little ending you can tack on other pieces. So nice stuff in there. Love it. I'm now going to flip over to Kevin Johnson's piece. And Kevin, I know, has told me he's not around this morning. He's at a symphony concert listening to Tchaikovsky, 6th Symphony. But we're going to check out his piece, and I will let MuseScore play it because he's done a really nice kind of arrangement job on it. And we'll let MuseScore play it, and I'll talk through what's going on here. And also talk about some opportunities to make a couple little tweaks here and there. That's not loud enough. Let's try that again. All right. So it's really nice. It's a beautiful piece. And Kevin's just really paying attention to his voice leading in the voicings, and he's chosen some really nice chords. So let's walk through. We're in the key of B flat, 1. And now he's approaching the G minor chord, right? We're eventually going to land on a G minor chord. So he's tonicizing it 2 different ways. He's giving it both a 5 chord and a 7 chord. Well, that's a very typical thing, that you might have the 5 chord and then the 7 chord. 2 to approach some chord. So when you're tonicizing, it's not either or. You can totally do them both, and you can do them both in either order. Yeah, you can do them in either order, but I think this is like the more common order. I haven't done a statistical analysis, so I can't say. But you will especially see this D7 followed by F sharp diminished to G minor in Baroque music, because it gives you the option of using that E flat at the end of the thing. So you might have D7, then have an E flat in the melody against your F sharp chord and not have to have an actual D7 flat 9. It's not like Bach never used flat 9 chords. He did, but he often kind of hedged on it and said, well, I'm not going to play these two notes at the same time. I'm going to play, and just, you know, something in how he arpeggiated it or moved the line voice leading wise. He could weasel out of saying it's a D7 flat 9 by saying, oh, he played a D7, then an F sharp diminished. And so Kevin is doing a Bach-like thing here. And now he's using C sharp diminished to tonicize the D minor. And in this case, he's got it in an inversion, which is a very typical, again, Baroque technique of playing your diminished chord in first inversion. It's a very typical thing, and the idea is if you play a diminished triad and don't put a seventh on it, then there's no tritone above the bass note. Diminished chords always have tritones in them, but the diminished chord, if I play a C sharp triad and put an E in the bass, at least the tritone isn't above the bass note. And so you will definitely find Baroque and classical composers putting diminished triads in first inversion a lot. By the time you add the seventh to it, well, now you've got a tritone above the bass. There's not any longer an advantage to putting it in inversion, but there's nothing wrong with it either. And in this case, he has a nice bass line to lead there. And so it totally makes it work. All right, now he's got 4 going to 2. Going to 5, and he's got that sus4 going, 4 resolving to 3 thing there. And now F sharp diminished to tonicize the G minor again. And then B flat 7 to tonicize the E flat, and our melody note is whole step above a chord tone. Melody note, whole step a chord tone, whole step above a chord tone, and then resolving down, and then giving us our minor 4. Now, then, instead of resolving that minor 4 directly to 1, he's actually going to resolve it to 3, right? Which is fine. That's a deceptive resolution. Minor 4 to 3. So he could have gone directly from minor 4 to 3, and that would have been fine, but he's doing another thing of giving that D minor a diminished chord to resolve down a half step. I don't hear that motion a lot, that minor 4, then diminished 4 into 3. I can't say that I've ever heard that before. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not a common thing to do, but nothing wrong with it at all. And then 3, 6, 2, 5, 1, right? So just nice. Lots of nice stuff going on in here. So the only thing that I want to try to make happen is I want to try to work in that diminished chord approach to the actual 2 chord. All right. So the place that I see where that could happen, the half step above approach to the 2, because his only place where he's got this approach from above, C sharp diminished over E, but it's not really, right? The bass line is coming from above, but the root of the chord is the C sharp. So it's really coming from a half step below as far as the root is. So he's got this E flat diminished going to D. So that is an actual half step above approach. But it's going to 3 instead of 2. I want to make it happen to 2. And I found a couple different places to do this. So I'm going to play this measure here, starting on the 4 chord. So he's got 4 to 2. Well, what if it went like this? 4, and then sharp 2 diminished, and then our 2. We would then have our half step from our approach into the 2 chord from a half step. And we could do it right at the beginning of the measure. Right? Could do it. We don't even need the 4 chord. And if we did it at the beginning of the measure, then we'd even have D minor. We'd have 3 to sharp 2 diminished to 2, which would absolutely be, that's the Beatles thing again, and not just the Beatles. So I'm going to try to play it that way. See, I like that a lot because it sounds familiar. It sounds the way other people would have done it. But if we all did the things that other people would have done, it's not interesting, right? You got to be you. So I'm not saying this is better, but I am saying that this is the more expected way. Let me try to play that again. That is the only change that I would make. It's just getting that diminished chord in there, not because it's better than the E flat, but because it gives me that opportunity to approach the 2 chord with a half step from above. And that's one of the things that I wanted to try to get to happen in this assignment. Now, I did find one other place to try it, and I'm going to show you this also. And that is, here we have this G minor, and that G minor is nicely tonicized by this F sharp diminished chord, and that's all well and good. Then he's going straight to a B flat 7 here, and then E flat. So this B flat is tonicizing the E flat. What if I made this a secondary 2-5? 2-5-1 in the key of E flat. Now that I have a 2 chord, so if I put a 2 chord here, F minor 7, then my B flat 7 to E flat, if I did that, now I can use that half step above approach into the 2. And it does work with the melody, kind of. Right? When I say kind of, at the moment when I play this F sharp diminished chord, the B flat's still in the melody and it's clashing with the A, but this might be one of those times when you can get away with it, right? You can maybe get away with it because maybe the B flat's died out a little bit and we're about to jump away from it. And this note's a good note. It's a whole step above a chord tone. So, that's not better, but it would be another opportunity to squeeze in that thing. So Peter, I see that you were saying feels repetitive from the C sharp in the previous measure. So this C sharp here in the second measure feels repetitive having this one in here. I'm not going to deny that. Yeah, it is. It is a little bit repetitive. That's a good call, Peter. So the fact that I've got a C sharp in the middle of this measure, C sharp diminished, and then I'm asking for another C sharp diminished there, it does feel a little awkward. I personally would sacrifice this one. I would sacrifice the one on beat 2, if it were me. I might make it be A7 flat 9 going to the D minor, and then I might not notice the repetition. Now A7 with a flat 9 in the melody and C sharp diminished, still awfully close. So I'm not going to claim that that's better, and maybe I would just skip that chord entirely. There's no reason I couldn't hang on to the G minor chord. Right? That would work also, holding on to the G minor for 2 beats. it doesn't improve the song. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it allows us to use a technique that I wanted to see us try to use, which is approaching the 2-chord specifically from a half step above. And Peter, I do think that was a good call to see if making that choice made us want to try something else in bar 2. And yeah, I think that's probably, if it were my piece, that's probably what I would have written. But as I often say, it's not either or, right? None of this stuff is either or. This is only 8 bars. If this was going to be a full 32-bar tune, we're going to hear that same 8 bars 3 times in AABA form, and you could harmonize it differently. A big Cole Porter thing, by the way, is to have AABA tunes where the A sections have these subtle, interesting variations. Anyhow, that's been the show. So hopefully you found some useful things. And yes, we're getting deep. We started off trying to lay a solid foundation so that we would be able to get deep. And now we're getting deep into these things. So hopefully you can review what you need to review and catch up and work on these projects. And we'll see y'all next week doing more of the same. So thanks everyone for the music. Thanks for the comments and questions. And so next, I encourage everyone to review what you need to about the diminished chords. Try your hand at that project. And really, all you need to do is find a couple of places to approach some 2 chords. Find some places to approach some 2 chords, and then move on to the final set of lessons in this section about tritone substitutions and augmented 6 chords. And I'll have another project posted by the weekend about augmented 6 chords. And then we're done with new chords. And then we solidify things. We work on applying these things, analyzing music so we can really see how things are done in practice. We'll have all the vocabulary we need after next week. So really looking forward to being able to go over that stuff with you. So I will see you all next time. Goodbye, everyone.